I ended a relationship in 2007, and pretty much on the last day of that relationship, I was aware that 10 years before there had been a first day. And it was a very specific beginning and end, and that somewhere between those 2 points was a very good story, and a story that I hadn't actually seen, but that I thought that if I got the details of what I remembered of that relationship, if I got them right, that it would be relevant to other people. That somehow the dynamic between the two characters, though specific to their own story, was one that is not unique, let's put it that way. So it took a while for me to be fully ready to write the film, and I worked with a wonderful co-writer, Mauricio Zacharias, who took what ended up being scenes that I'd written from the film, and also all my journals, which I handed over to him. And I used to keep a lot of journals. And in a way you could see that the film reflects that kind of storytelling that you find in a diary, for example, so that there are these patches of drama, and in between there's breaks, and then the next and the next. And in a way, I think you can see the film as both a diary, but also a form of memory, because it's also a way in which you remember things and certain kind of incidents over time. Well, I think that's what the movie's about. I mean, I think Eric is dealing with a number of things. I think in a way you could see the film as a coming-of-age film. And on one level, I would say that it's a story about two men who both don't maybe like themselves well enough to be without the other. And that somehow there's an attachment that is so strong that it's almost unbreakable. And whether it's love or whether it's compulsion, or whether it's a lack of self-love in a certain way. I think by the end of the film, what you could say is that both characters like themselves well enough to let go. And I think that is, in some level, a growing up process. And I think if you ask me what Eric's dealing with, it's becoming an adult, which, many of us might, you can be an adult and still be fucked up. So, I don't know. But I think, for me, I would say the next chapter of this story is the film itself, which is in a way an inverse of the entire story you've watched, because it's a film that's told very openly and shamelessly. And it's a story, on the other hand, that's told, which is all about secrets and darkness and shame in a certain way. So that's actually where the title comes from. I mean, I think if you say, what is Eric's problem, then Eric's problem is that he's keeping everything in the dark. And I think that's a difficult place to be. Yeah, I guess I've lived in New York for 25 years, and this is my first narrative film about the city. To me, within a very crowded place, very private, very intimate things do happen. And I think what's interesting to me is to try to tell a story that includes the city and is in a way about the city, but it's told very much from the inside. So it's a certain kind of intimacy that comes, that there's almost no, you never see New York except through the experience of being there, which is how these characters maybe live there. There is an absence of certain kind of markers, including the absence of 9/11 as a particular marker. I think that there is an enclosed feeling to the lives of these two characters that in a way is also part of the problem, is that they've made their world smaller and smaller, and by the end of the film, it's just the two of them. The last shot of the film, or nearly the last shot, when you see them on the street and they're parting, what I think is sort of what I respond to in that, and what I remember, and what I think is actually true, New York or otherwise, is that a city is full of these very small stories that go unnoticed, and that's always part of what was interesting to me. So New York is also in the film because of the artwork in the film, and the search for this other filmmaker, Avery Willard, within the film, and the image of James Bidgood, who's the older man in the purple shirt who talks about Nixon, who's a filmmaker who made Pink Narcissus in the late 60s, early 70s. The paintings at the beginning of the film that are actually my husband, Boris Torres's work, who, by the way, if you want to know, Eric married Igor, if you were curious. In real life. In real life. Yes, Eric and Igor got together, and we had kids actually 8 months ago. So to me, part of New York is this is the history of the city, which I think this film attempts to make visible, and I think it's something that for me, I hadn't seen a film about my New York, and I wanted to make one. So. I found Zach Booth early in the process. He plays Paul. We had his agent was a friend of mine. He introduced me. We had a long lunch. He took a scene from the film and he performed it in an audition. And what I was struck by was that he understood and empathized with Paul in a way that was very deep. And he also was able to convey the vulnerability of the character. There's definitely a surface that's quite strong, but I think Zach really understood that underneath there was a lot to be protected, and he was holding that in, and I was very moved by that. And I think you see it really towards the end of the film, where he almost becomes a different character in a certain way. I think particularly the scene when the two of them have a meal, having been apart for a year. And suddenly, it's as if it's the effect of sobriety, but it's actually just acting. I mean, that's he was able to convey that shift, and that shift of maturation or recovery or whatever you want to call it, so well. And Eric was harder to cast. It took a couple of months. I sent the script to an agent in LA that I often send work, and I got the response that no one in the agency would be available for this part, which was, I think the movie ultimately is not so radical in terms of its image making, but I think on paper it felt too sexual and too naked in a certain way. I heard about Tor Lindhardt, who was described as the bravest actor in Denmark, and I hadn't thought that the character would be Danish, but I made a film about a Russian woman living in Memphis called 40 Shades of Blue, and that initially had not been a Russian woman, and I've found a certain connection to non-American actors that somehow there's a style that's very messy and lifelike, you might say. And I saw Tor. He auditioned with some material. He was alone in a hotel room in Spain, and so he took his cell phone and he did a couple of scenes, and he picked all the scenes that you can do alone in a hotel room. So he did a series of masturbation scenes. And he was good at them, and he was compelling. I mean, that was really what it was. So they had never met before, a week before we started shooting, and it's always about instinct, and the instinct was right. They really became extremely loving, friendly. We had a pretty joyous time on a set that had a lot of drama in the story. We had a lot of fun, and I think that fun is actually important as for the actors to bring some level of life underneath these really challenging moments. The question is whether there was improvisation. Yes and no. I would say 85% of the film is scripted as we wrote it, but often what I do is I try to insert certain places where the film, I actually do think of every fictional film as a form of documentary. There's not so much difference. Ultimately, you have people in front of you, you have locations, you have a camera, and what you're trying to capture is something that happens in life. Not like life, but in life with the camera. And so what I tend to do is I soften certain entry points to that. So for example, I don't use action. The actors sort of begin on when they're ready to, and I don't use cut. So sometimes the scenes go on. Eventually I cut. That's not true. I do, but I let them go a little bit. So for example, the scene where they have a fight, and then you see them playfully on the bed in the film after they've made up. That little bed part was something that we just got at the end of one take. But the rest of it was all scripted. I also put in these scenes like the party in Berlin, or the surprise party, which are, the surprise party is actually, it's my apartment, it's my friends, and a bunch of Danish people we got. So it was like, it felt close to what it would be. And I think that makes it, it's a kind of trick that I found early in filmmaking, that if I put those things in, everything else feels more connected to the world as well. Yeah, so he's talking about Arthur Russell. All the music in the film is by Arthur Russell, who was a musician who died in 1993 of AIDS. And I discovered his work through an incredible documentary called Wild Combination, which I recommend. Go home, Netflix it, put it on the top of your list. It's the story of Arthur in New York. His music, most of which was not heard in his lifetime. When he died, his partner Tom Lee maintained boxes and boxes of recordings that Arthur had made, and about 10 years later, people started to hear Arthur's music, and it started to get released album by album, and I approached Tom and Audica Records about working with me on the film, thinking that I could use his music similarly to how Simon and Garfunkel, for example, is used in The Graduate, or Amy Mann, if anyone's seen Magnolia, where a whole score is created from this pop music. And what's really, I guess, and as you say, it's part of the legacy. It's part of it's another layer of the kind of history, the invisible history of New York, really, and particularly of gay culture in New York. What's moving to me now is the last song in the film, which I didn't really notice this until I started to come back for Q&As and always hear the last song of the film. And it's called "This Is How We Walk on the Moon." And to me, that actually defines what the film is about. It was about Arthur and Tom, how they walked on the moon. But you could also say that this story is just an attempt to say, well, this is how we walked on the moon. This is how these characters walked on the moon. This is what the moon looked like in that time, which on some level is kind of my role as a filmmaker, is to be a historian and try to make things that can be testaments to how the world looked at the time that I was making them. So Arthur's music is infinitely meaningful to me, so thank you for bringing it up. Besides casting the actors, the other equally important casting that I do, I mean, as a director, is to choose who to shoot the film, the cinematographer that I work with. Early in the process, it turned out that we were going to be able to shoot on film, so it's shot on Super 16 film, and I spent a lot of time figuring out who has a vision or a way of shooting that somehow feels like a perfect sort of complement to the story and to what I'm looking for. And I heard about Thimios Bakatakis, who is a Greek cinematographer who did a movie called Dogtooth, if anyone's seen that film. He also did a film called Attenberg, both of which were shot on Super 16. And he has a very, it's beautiful, but it's also a very gentle approach. And there's a accomplished use of natural lighting, primarily, which I think leads to a certain kind of painterly quality to the work. But maybe most importantly to me, or one of the things, was he really shoots a lot of sex, and does so unlike anyone I've ever seen, because the sex it's like a scene that has sex in it is not different for him than a scene of a birthday party or a dinner at a restaurant. There's a lack of judgment to his eye as a cinematographer that I think is very crucial to the meaning of the film in a certain way. Because one of the things I wanted to do was that the film not be compartmentalized the way that the lives are, so that the film doesn't separate a sex scene from another scene. They're part of the daily life of these characters, whether they share it or not. And I think Thimios has, I surrounded myself, to tell you the truth, with lots of non-Americans. It was good, my co-writer was Brazilian, my editor is Brazilian, my script supervisor was Romanian, my lead actor was Danish, my cinematographer was Greek, and I think there was a way in which there's a kind of coming from a pretty repressed culture. It was like to embrace myself with people who have a different take on life was really important and useful, I think, to the openness of the film in general. And ultimately, I think that's what the film, I hope, encourages, is a certain, a sort of transparency. You know, I think the title is a call to arms for people to keep the lights on and to consider the possibility of transparency in life. And I hope that it sort of encourages that conversation. Thank you all so much.